just to give people a kind of vision, reports, which you rightfully say, Tamara, are probably underreported, are saying that nearly 2,700 people have been directly impacted by COVID. And that is a number that's higher than the total results of 13 states. And so this is something that is having a profound impact, and the lack of infrastructure within that these tribes have access to is also compounding the problem, which really is something that we have seen over and over again, that COVID is not creating racial disparities, exposing historically, systemically rooted disparities that are really manifesting themselves in casualties right now. And but when you spoke just a minute ago, you both have referenced it a couple of times. I want you to talk a little bit about how this failure on the government's part to actually do what it said it was going to do just echoes this historic reality of government failing to fulfill its promises and its commitments to Indigenous communities.
Okay, I could speak a little bit to that. And I think you have a lot of questions, so I'll speak to just growing up on the reservation, and you see a lot of internalized oppression. You see lots of separate issues with health issues, mental issues, suicidal, suicide. You see high rates of these things. And I just remember as a child growing up just saying, man, this is a messed up place to live. Like, golly, I remember, although we're tribal people, I wasn't born on the tribe, but my mother, who also was a tribal member, moved us to the tribe. And I remember I was like 7 years old. And because we're a mixed heritage, I spent my first years growing up in the city of San Diego, which is a beautiful place and different dynamics. And then being moved to the reservation with my mother telling me, these are your people, and looking around, and it wasn't really pleasant to the eyes. It was, you could see, the housing looked different. It looked like, I don't want to use the wrong word, but it just looked like a place that I didn't want to stay. And I just remember being angry as a child about that. And as I grew up, you could see that even as a child, I could recognize that this place where we live is different. Something's different. The lawns are not landscaped. The homes just look a little different, and people do things a little bit differently over here. And then I got in high school, and you start visiting other schools, and you start looking around, and people act differently. People look differently. And the reason I bring that up is because the way the government, I believe, has failed Native Americans a second time and continue to do some of these things over and over, it's very apparent. And you don't have to be an expert in Native studies to know that. Just growing up, you recognize it. You may not know why, but it creates all these questions about who you are, and why are we here? Why does where we live look different? And when I grew up, I always wanted to learn and find out why, to make a difference. And I remember even being in school, and we would get dropped off in the neighborhood, where the tribe has housing, and and I remember some of the kids saying, oh, man, you got to live in that Indian housing. Well, I didn't know. I didn't know there was, I didn't know. Everybody recognized it. I can't hide it. I'm from here. But right away, you start feeling shame. And if you look historically at how tribal members were treated, or Native Americans as a whole were treated, a lot of shame was brought into the Native populations. There was a lot of respect and dignity of tribal people. When we gathered our own food, we led our people, we raised our people, we strengthened that, we taught the men about providing, and the women were gatherers, and we had such strong community. And that was disrupted initially. But all these years later, you know, when the government forced Native Americans to live on reservations, it happens again, and it's apparent. You can go to any reservation, and you know when you're on the reservation. You know when you're there. I don't care what tribe you go to. I don't care how much money they have. You're going to know you're on the reservation, and it's not always a good thing. Um, so I believe the way the government has perpetuated some of these things again and again, and the treaties that were broken. I remember about 20 years ago, I can't think the exact year, but a lot of tribal records were found in a warehouse with uh, 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 bird droppings on it, and mice infestations and lost records, and this is the history of a lot of tribes that already suffered broken treaties, and land stolen, and land just given away, where people could just put a stake in the ground and say, we own this land. And that was traumatic overall to tribes. So now, fast forwarding today, you look at this and you say, look at us, we're still really kind of in the same boat. We may say, okay, well, this is our tribe, this is our reservation, this is where we live, but the control and the dependency is there in the way that, just like when, you know, I remember my mother talking about when she was a child going to a boarding school and how they cut her hair off, and a lot of things was forced upon her. But most of the culture, you're not able to speak your Kwuh-tsan language. My mom was told that she spoke a Kwuh-tsan language fluently, and I apologize. I usually start with introducing that I'm the daughter of the late Denise Dugan Tecumseh, and in our lineage, you know, our great 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 grandfather was a chief, a peaceful chief. And so some of these stories, they're rich in our history. So when you have the government treating some of the records that give us identity to where we came from, just thrown in a warehouse with, you know, nothing, and damaged and ruined, and now people, you know, that's a big thing. And so today, when you look at how the government's doing that, it's kind of the same thing. Well, it's an identity thing. How much do you really matter? Tribes, oh, okay, well, we'll make these promises to them, but we don't have to really fulfill it. And a lot of times, the states and the county governments are able to claim the tribal members and the tribal community members statistically, or for the census, and get funding for schools and roads. You go on most reservations and the roads are tore up, there's potholes, and there's always an argument of, well, is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs going to pay for that, or the tribe? Well, these are millions of dollars, but yet the counties and the states are claiming funding for that, but the roads are, it's just a lot of issues that are still impacting the tribes today. Um, you have Indian Health Services that serves medically, provides medical care for tribal members, or Native Americans, community members, descendants, it doesn't matter. But even in lots of studies, that healthcare has been shown to be subpar, and not really at a level, an acceptable level. We've had a history of, you know, some of the stuff protected because of lawsuits and stuff that I can't talk about freely, but because of, you know, maybe sanitary practices not being held at the same level, and medical professionals being trained, or looking into the background of certain doctors and medical professionals, that backgrounds were just kind of messed up to where maybe they couldn't get a job anywhere, but they got a job with Indian Health Service. So that's just another way, when you dig under the surface in different areas, you see some of the same issues with, is our identity valued at all? And it kind of looks the same as it did back then. Not so much. We're in the way. Oh no, now you're just another group of people we have to cut money for. And I think that's what you see. And a lot of the education on the reservation, some of the schooling. So I could go on and on. I don't want to take up all the time, but that just getting that to that question, there's so much that could be talked about, and how the government, again, is not holding to some of the promises of helping Native Americans and helping Indian country. And I think even at times, if it's not intentional, it feels like it's intentional, because when you have a need, it doesn't matter why you have a need. The need is real. And, perception is reality. And all we know is, we have to rely on churches and other people to come and help us, because there's no clear answers. And a lot of times when the tribal government is not able to give an answer, it's because they don't have answers from the federal government. So that's another crippling thing, that we're going to give you your own government, but your government really depends on us. So they're just kind of like a middleman. So if you look at that picture, you can kind of just line it up with healthcare, education, housing, and all these other needs that's a basic human need, and see why, the government puts itself in a position to still be, have that impact. Now, can a tribe directly apply for funding from any other source? No, they have to go through the U.S. government protocol and wait for the government to respond. So I think that's enough with that. I didn't want to go overboard, but I do my best to try to paint a picture of how it all ties in today, and how it really looks the same as it did way back in the 1400s, when all this started with Native Americans being removed from land, and 90% of the Native peoples were wiped out from the pandemic of disease. And now look at today,
and that's a real fear even now that most people have, seeing that there was smallpox and tuberculosis and all that kind of stuff. And so you just have this intergenerational trauma. And now that we have this pandemic, it's all highlighted again. It's like 3 times as bad. People are, drinking is higher, and people using substances is higher from just being displaced, and all of the things that are just now. I mean, we're talking about this pandemic came in November of last year, they say. And just last week, our tribe got ventilators, 10 to be exact, and we had to give them we gave them to the hospital in town, because we don't even have the infrastructure to use them. Some tribes, that has been reported in the news, instead of them getting the help that they asked for, they got cadaver bags. Like, it's, and so this just creates another level of hopelessness. I know one lady that we've had the privilege to serve during this time, she said, I would rather die than to see everybody else die. So it heightens all of the fears that many people have right now, what's going to happen. And for some tribes, because they're not big, they're not as big as the Navajo, they're smaller, they're 1,000, they're 3,000, something like this can completely wipe them out. So it's just, and then those things are, again, it brings another level of PTSD. And then how do we heal that? So just a additional layer of trauma.